Welcome back in. Today we're going to be discussing our Week 11 wide receiver rankings, and we're just going to get right into it. They are as follows. Our wide receiver ones, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra St. Brown, A.J. Brown, Nico Collins, fingers crossed, Justin Jefferson, Cooper Kupp, George Pickens, Tyreek Hill, Puka Nacua, DK Metcalf, Deebo Samuel, and Terry McLaurin wraps up our wide receiver ones. Cody, hit us with the good stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty simple with the wide receiver ones. Any of these guys you're plugging in. I did just quickly want to bring up George Pickens, who has posted 2 top 5 finishes in 3 of Russell Wilson's starts so far. All the underlying numbers are there as well for him, even dating back to the beginning of the season. He is 6th in first read percentage, 5th in air yards, 9th in target share, 7th in yards per route run among receivers with at least 50 routes. Now gets a matchup against a Ravens secondary that is allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing wideouts. I can't believe I'm saying this as the Homer pessimist. If you followed along with our content for any period of time, you know one of my favorite pastimes is shitting on the Steelers, even though they were the team that I grew up on. But they're actually starting to be fun to watch. So maybe take this as a sign to pump the brakes a little bit on George Pickens if I'm getting excited about it. But the only other guy I wanted to mention here was DK Metcalf. Sounds like he should return this week along with Nico Collins, like you said, fingers crossed. But I just wanted to bring up Metcalf as a reminder of how good he was prior to his injury. Had at least 99 receiving yards in 4 of 7 games, had at least 7 targets in 5 of 7. It's a tougher matchup, but assuming that he's a full go, his role in this offense is going to have him at the back end wide receiver one conversation.
You don't really have anything to add to that. I completely agree with everything you said about George Pickens. I think he's a phenomenal play, just a phenomenal matchup. The Ravens secondary has been absolutely dreadful this year. So I definitely think he's very warranted being a top 10 wide receiver this week. So let's keep it moving. Let's move over to the wide receiver twos. And they are as follows: Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams, CeeDee Lamb, Zay Flowers, DeAndre Hopkins, Drake London, Cedric Tillman, Josh Downs, Jaden Reed, Devonta Smith, Lad McConkey, and Calvin Ridley. So same thing, Cody. Hit us with the wide receiver twos.
Yeah, Josh Downs has been one of the most consistent fantasy receivers this year, and whether or not Pittman plays, and despite the tough matchup here going up against the Jets secondary, he's simply been playing too good to have him not be ranked as a wide receiver 2 this week. You feel a little bit better about him in full PPR leagues as opposed to other formats, but the dude has at least 60 receiving yards in 6 of 8 games, at least 9 targets in 6 of 8. He's 9th in target share overall and is 11th in first read percentage. So you're firing him up. Next up is going to be Courtland Sutton. After seeing 0 targets 4 weeks ago, Courtland Sutton has been on a tear for the past 3 weeks, finishing as a top 26 wide receiver in 3 straight games. The last 2 being top 7 games for Courtland Sutton. Last week was also against a tough KC defense, which gives you more confidence this week, going up against a Falcons defense that is allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Sutton has seen 30 targets in his last 3 games, catching 21 for 292 and 2 scores. So I think he continues his dominant streak again in week 11. Juwan Jennings is also a guy that I'm interested in this week, going up against the Seahawks defense that just hasn't been able to put it all together this year. They are giving up the 12th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Jennings is also locked in as a key part of this offense for the rest of the season. Has played really well just in general. Saw another 11 targets last week, caught 7 for 93, all of which led the 49ers. San Fran has the second highest implied team total this week, and the game total is the highest for week 11. Somebody I'm a little bit lower on this week is Terry McLaurin. He's a consensus wide receiver 1 for us, but I have him a little bit lower than you do, Kev. He's been super consistent, especially going back to week 3, but he only has 2 top 10 finishes on the year. Everything else has been between like wide receiver 14 and 26, I believe. You're still likely starting him, but the Eagles defense is starting to click and play much better. So just wanted to throw that out there, depending on what your situation is when you're setting your lineups. If you needed like a higher upside play, you might want to look elsewhere.
Yeah, just a couple of names that I want to talk about. One was DeAndre Hopkins. I do really like this matchup for him this week. Hopkins is playing over 50% of the snaps from the slot. That's really where you want to target the Buffalo Bills this week. And so while last week it wasn't a great matchup for him going up against Patrick Surtain, I do think this matchup sets up a lot nicer for DeAndre Hopkins this week. So I think he is a borderline top 15 wide receiver play this week. Drake London, I'm a little bit concerned about Drake London this week. Just the same thing we talked about. He's only running about 35% of the snaps from the slot right this year. I was hoping he'd be more of that big slot wide receiver for the Falcons. That really hasn't been so much the case. And so I just don't love this spot. He's going to see a lot of Patrick Surtain. They're going to focus a lot on Drake London. And I just would have lowered expectations for someone like Drake London. That's why I have him as like a borderline wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 this week. And then Cedric Tillman, I think I really do like this situation for the Browns this week going up against the Saints. Saints, obviously, their secondary is not great. I think that Cedric Tillman probably has the highest ceiling of all their wide receivers. But I also think that someone like Elijah Moore is also somebody that I wouldn't sleep on as another option this week in PPR formats. And then lastly, the Charger situation here. I have Ladd McConkey as a top 24 wide receiver this week. I really like his spot against the Bengals. I think this game has some shootout potential. We know the Bengals defense is not very good this year. They've really struggled. I actually think him and Quentin Johnson should probably both be in the consideration for top 36 wide receivers this week. QJ actually has the better matchup between the two of them. He actually has a top 12 matchup this week. Quentin Johnson does. So I think both those wide receivers you can fire up. Anyways, let's keep it moving. Let's move on to the wide receiver 3s. And they are as follows: Cortland Sutton, Khalil Shakir, Darnell Mooney, Juwan Jennings, Jalen Waddle, Tank Dell, JSN, T. Higgins, Amari Cooper, Jacoby Myers, Jameson Williams, and Jerry Jeudy wrapping up our wide receiver 3s. Cody, hit us with the wide receiver 3s.
Yeah, you mentioned Ladd McConkey. I just want to throw a couple more things out there. Since he has allowed the 15th most fantasy points per game to wideouts on the season, but over the last 3 weeks, that number jumps up to the 8th most. And then, like you were mentioning with the game environment, we have a solid total here with a 47-point over/under, 3.5-point spread. So I agree with you, man. I think this one could have some fireworks here. Other than that, Jalen Waddle just outside of my top 24 this week, but it's hard not to love this spot going up against the Raiders, who look better on paper in terms of their fantasy points against numbers. But I think that has to do a lot with like the game script and being run all over all season. I think it's possible we see Waddle used more here with the report that came out this past week that Tyreek Hill has been dealing with a torn ligament in his wrist. This shouldn't be a spot where Miami, quote unquote, needs to feature Tyreek Hill either. And it did look like early on in that game against the Rams that Waddle was a focal point of that game plan. So it wouldn't surprise me to see that continue. And lastly here, Jacoby Myers finds himself in a tough matchup against a surprisingly solid Dolphins defense, but his usage alone keeps him in the wide receiver 3/flex consideration. Myers has at least 7 targets in 5 straight games, as well as at least 9 in 4 of his last 5. The Raiders are 7.5-point dogs in this spot as well, so that target volume isn't likely to stop this week either.
Yeah, I just want to hit on a couple wide receivers actually outside of the top 36. One is Brian Thomas. It has been pretty concerning to see his usage the last couple of weeks. I think a lot of it maybe has to do with the chest injury that he suffered. Because really, since that injury, he just hasn't really been the same. Now, obviously, it didn't help that they had Mac Jones, the starting quarterback, last week, and he looked absolutely abysmal. But either way, it has been pretty concerning with him. So it's not actually a bad matchup. Detroit actually struggles, against the pass. I mean, they are much more of a pass funnel. If you have a better option, I think it might be time to sit Brian Thomas until we see something better from him because we're just constantly getting very low output, very low production. Because he didn't even have a target, I think, until the fourth quarter of that game. Like, it's been super frustrating. And he's just been out there running wind sprints. I don't really understand it because if he is healthy, then everybody needs to be fired because he is clearly their best wide receiver, their most explosive wide receiver. But I just have to figure that there's something else going on there. And I don't know why at this point they haven't just let him sit for a couple of weeks instead of having him run out there if he truly is still nursing some sort of injury that we just don't know about. DJ Moore is kind of interesting to me. I want to really see what this Bears offense looks like without Shane Waldron. I mean, we remember the offseason hearing someone like JSN talk about how bad Shane Waldron was. Finally, the Bears have moved on from Shane Waldron, and hopefully this offense can kind of take a step forward because it's been super frustrating because they don't use motion. They don't do all the stuff that we see, today's offenses do to try to get these guys into space. They don't do any of those things. So hopefully whoever's taking over as the offensive coordinator now does some of these things because you have too much talent with Roma Dunze and DJ Moore to not be able to see a better offense out of this team and I get it, their offensive line is terrible, but if you understand that, then do different things to be able to get the ball out of the hands of Caleb Williams quickly. Don't have him sit back there and try to process stuff going downfield, whatever. He's never going to be able to get to those reads because their offensive line is so bad. So hopefully, we see an uptick for DJ Moore rest of season now with this happening,
Yeah.
with them moving on from that. So I think Ricky Pearsall is also in play in this matchup against Seattle. That has some fireworks attached to it as well. So I think those are some of the wide receivers outside of your top 36 you can definitely take a look at.
Yeah, I'm with you on Quentin Johnson and Ricky Pearsall. Just some other names to throw out quickly. Demario Douglas doesn't have that high of a ceiling, but he continues to be the clear wide receiver one on this offense. Not that that is a high bar to clear by any means, but he does have at least 9 targets in 4 of his games this year. So this is a situation where I think you could look to him if you had to. Rashad Bateman is another guy I like. Although the matchup doesn't look great, we did just see Terry McLaurin go for over 100 yards against this defense. And we've also seen a little bit of a change in how Rashad Bateman is being used. He's starting to get some more first read looks in that offense, and he's no longer like the kind of guy where you're hoping that, like, hey, maybe one of these 3 connects for like a 50-yard touchdown. He started to get more involved in this offense, which is obviously a good sign for him. So I do like Rashad Bateman in this spot as well. And then Alec Pierce. I think AD Mitchell is the guy you want, obviously, for dynasty and for long term. I think he has more upside. But Alec Pierce just seems to be the guy who's being used more often. So I think if you needed to have like a boom bust, higher variance type of play, you could look to Alec Pierce.